All right, folks, going live again for twice in as many days. Although it feels weird to do anything esoteric related on the day after Halloween. I feel like, um, I don't know. It's like I feel weird even releasing a video today, but here we are. But I'm really happy to be joined with Dr. Dana Trell, the modern hermeticist, and I guess we're gonna kind of talk about this book that we've. I don't know about you, Dan, but it kind of feels like when I actually got it in hand, I have it here. It felt like, kind of holy crap, we did a book. Well, I guess I will say first and foremost is congratulations. You really did a fantastic job on all of this. Folks should know that Dan really did the lion's share, more than the lion's share of the translation and the notes and the bibliography. It's really this is a project that Dan deserves enormous amounts of credit for. And so, congratulations, Dan, on this book.
Well, thank you very much. I was very pleased to work on it. And it really is nice to hold it in your hands because, a lot of the stuff that we do is digital and just uploaded into the ether. And so you can never really see the object that you've produced and put all this work into. So it is nice to have an actual artifact and to be able to hold it in your hands and run your fingers through the pages. And I've been pleased with the cover art and with the cream pages and all that. And so I'm very pleased with it. So I hope that people enjoy it and that people get something out of it.
Yeah, I hope people do. And I guess maybe the first thing we can talk about is sort of the origins of how we did this, why we ended up doing these translations. And I guess what I found interesting when I was preparing for this whole Agrippa seminar was just how much of Agrippa wrote. I think that most people really don't have a good sense of, like, he kind of wrote the two books and that's it. And it just is one of these weird artifacts of I don't know, Renaissance stuff in general. I think that in general, people just don't have any idea how much material, esoteric material, actually remains untranslated. And for me, it was just looking at this and sort of sight translating it for to prepare the lectures and realizing, like, holy crap, this is super interesting, like deeply hermetic material. And that's basically why I pitched the idea to you. I was like, well, you're the man who's already doing that. You're an expert in that field, so it's sort of kismet in that way. But I guess that's the thing that I would want to emphasize to folks is that there is just so much out there, even in Agrippa, that is just waiting to be translated. And so that was kind of the origin of it. Was like we're all interested in this hermetic renaissance, but the fact of the matter is, key text by a key figure, not only are they not translated in English, but some of them don't even have modern editions. So it's just I don't know about how you feel about that, but it was like it was sort of surprising to me that it just didn't exist even in modern editions. Some of this stuff.
Yeah, I mean, you came to me in the summer around the beginning of the course that you ran, the seminar, and you had a list of
Mm.
works that you thought, you know, not all of these necessarily, but some of these are what I would consider the more occult or esoteric works that have not been translated yet. There was the juvenile draft as
Mhm.
well of the 1510 De Occulta Philosophia, but I didn't want to rehash or retranslate something even though it may be different that
Mhm.
had been already done by other translators. So we looked at through this list and we kind of narrowed it down to a number of works that we thought were worthwhile to translate. And there were still other works as well that
Mhm.
we thought about doing, but I figured that if we were going to do a facing translation of the Latin and the English, I would get too unwieldy too quickly. I mean, the book as it stands is what, 300 pages, is it? Uh
Yeah, close.
yeah, something like that. 258 in the Kindle version, which is has different page setting than the actual physical work, but it's a large work.
Mhm.
And so we could have done more, but that would have also prolonged the amount of time it would have done to do the project. And we wanted to get it out sort of on the heels of the seminar because people were, the interest was high. People were having their nose deep in Agrippa at that point, and we wanted to, have something available to them by the time the seminar ended. So that kind of capped off how much we wanted to, we didn't want to bite off more than we could chew,
Right.
and then end up stuck with a project for years and years and years, which is really, I have 3 other books on the go at the moment, and I've been working on these for years now, and they just take forever and ever because it's just such long works. Or I work in a team, and then I can only meet on Sundays, let's say, and work for 3-4 hours Sunday mornings. So it was nice to work solo and to just bang out 8-hour days, and get that project done as quickly as possible. And that felt nice because it's quite different from the pace that I'm used to working with my other projects, where there's just giant 700-page works like Arcangelo Borgonovo's commentary on Pico della Mirandola. I think I'm at 300 pages in, and there's another 300-400 pages left to go. So who knows when I'll be done that? But I tend to work at a rate of about a page or two a day when I'm really dedicated to it, and that pace comes and goes. But yeah, so there were other works like the commentary on Plato's Symposium,
Hmm.
which another reason why I wasn't sure if we should do that one was because I wasn't sure the extent to which it was similar to Ficino's commentary
Right.
on Plato's Symposium, and then Pico's commentary as well. And so they both have their own commentaries, and I haven't read it yet. So, but I assume that a lot of that material is drawn quite closely from Ficino and Pico, if his other works are any evidence of that,
Right.
because he really does draw heavily on his Renaissance contemporaries or near contemporaries, the foremost of which were Reuchlin, Pico,
Right.
Ficino,
Pico and Ficino.
um,
And often
Francesco
just like quoting
Giorgi.
them. Yeah. Like
Yeah,
often just like nearly quoting them, like knitting together them in paraphrase, which is
yeah.
typical of the time.
And so the main work that really, the main work in this collection is the Three Ways of Knowing
Hmm.
God, and that is, it's a very Christian mystical work, but it's also an extremely hermetic work. That work draws very, very heavily on Ludovico Lazzarelli's
Hmm.
uh, his Crater Hermetis, and so he draws a lot of the hermetic material directly from there, not even from necessarily Ficino or Ficino's translation of the Corpus Hermeticum. He draws a lot of it directly from Lazzarelli, and I figured that out by reading the Italian and English translation by Vittoria Perone Compagni, who already had an edition and a translation of that work, and she did a lot of the mining and digging to find out where all of Agrippa's sources were, and so that work was particularly invaluable. So I thanked her in the introduction, and shout out to her because she did a lot of great work that went into this project. Other notable mentions were Wouter Hanegraaff,
Hmm.
especially for his better than magic hypothesis. That article was really important in getting us set on the right path. And also the work of Allen and Hankins, who did the Platonic theology, uh, which is a work by Ficino. That's a work that's extensively quoted. So there were a lot of scholars. Brian Copenhaver, of
Sure.
course, not only translator of the Corpus Hermeticum, which is quoted at length, but also works very, very deeply on Pico della Mirandola.
Hmm.
And so you have this giant in the field of Renaissance esotericism, who's got a hand in uh, Hermeticism, but also a hand in Pico studies, and both of those currents flow into Agrippa pretty extensively.
Yeah, and I think this is a thing that is interesting to me. Is that, and I'd get your thinking on this as well, is that Agrippa is just one of these characters that really is more celebrated than known. Again, even thinking of the edition of the Crater Hermetis by Ludovico Lazzarelli that Wouter Hanegraaff did, it's interesting that that I think Agrippa, the threefold way of knowing God, like I think that text is basically unknown largely. And I guess what is interesting about that when you read that text in light of the three books on occult philosophy, one one gets a very I don't know, one gets a very different sense of what Agrippa was actually up to. And I think that the way that and this is the thing I mentioned at the end of the seminar, is that we most of the way that Agrippa gets read now is through via Francis Barrett, and Barrett basically mined out all the stuff that was, the practical stuff, and the practical stuff, and what was edited out basically was the occult philosophy.
Hmm.
And that's, I think, an interesting thing. And what I would say to people is that um, that um, what's the right way of putting it? That Agrippa's philosophy, I think, actually is lost. It's largely lost in the appreciation of him as an occultist. And I think that's one of the things that comes out, is really getting a vision into his actual philosophical thinking in texts like the Pavia lecture and the Threefold Way of Knowing God, which I think that in some ways is going to be shocking to people, that the Agrippa that they think they know is not actually the Agrippa that they know. But is there anything that, when you were translating and working on this, that jumped out at you as, like, I don't know, revelatory of Agrippa in a way that you were surprised by?
I don't think I was surprised by much, to be honest, because I just finished my PhD on the Latin polemical tradition and on Pico and Ficino, and I did a lot of work on Reuchlin. So I had done already a lot of work on all of the different authors that flow into Agrippa,
Hmm.
and also in the world that Agrippa inhabited. And so I hadn't done too much work on Agrippa the man himself, but uh, you pick up stuff along the way. But I had done so much on all of his sources that, to me, Agrippa seems to just echo a lot of the stuff that's already floating around in the air at the time. And so that wasn't all that surprising. But a useful kind of thing that I thought about was how this was thanks to Wouter Honnegraaff, who talks about how when Ficino was translating the Corpus Hermeticum, he didn't really quite grok that gnosis was important.
Hmm.
Um, he kind of he didn't have a clear sense of how kind of profoundly Gnostic the Corpus Hermeticum is, and uh, Ludovico Lazzarelli, sometimes called Louis Lazaret, is uh, is one translator who did grasp that
Hmm.
idea of gnosis. And I think that Agrippa ran with that, especially in the three ways of knowing God, because again, that's what the work is about, is that there are ways of knowing God who is ultimately unknowable, because God reveals himself in certain way through the quote unquote invisible things of God, hence the name of the book. Invisibilia Dei is the invisible things of God, and he shows that there are three paths to knowing God, and that this is a kind of progressive revelation throughout history. That you have the knowledge of the pagans, who approached God through the knowledge of created things, and so you can think of the pre-Socratics and of the philosophers of antiquity. They came to know God through creation. And then you have the law, which is the way that the ancient Hebrews came to know God, and that bifurcates as well, because you have Torah, but then you also have Kabbalah, and so those are the two ways of knowing God. And then you have the third way, which is the gospel, and that is ultimately the culmination of all the ways of knowing God. And to me, this is really it ties into a lot of that Latin polemical tradition, the idea that you have this supersessionary religion in Christianity that supersedes paganism, that supersedes Judaism. And Agrippa really is expressing that in his own unique way.
Hmm.
So it's a lot of themes that I was familiar with, but it was expressed in a way that I thought was very coherent, in a way that had not really been expressed as clearly elsewhere and as succinctly as well.
Right.
Because I worked on Ficino on the Christian religion prior to working on this, and there's a lot of that material in Ficino as well. But again, Ficino is not as concerned with this kind of Gnostic element of it. Um, and there's a tension at work there too, of course, because there is the gnosis, a knowledge of God, but then there's also the extent to which you do not know God.
Hmm.
So there's a an apophatic and a cataphatic approach, a tension between those two approaches to God that we can see very clearly in Agrippa's work.
Yeah, and
So
yeah, and I think that that's what was most interesting to me is that the three books of occult philosophy, the philosophy is distributed basically between all this other connective tissue, which is a bunch of quotes from Pliny and random sigil magic and all kinds of other stuff. And so it's actually easy to miss the thread of the actual occult philosophy in the three books of occult philosophy in a way that in the many ways the threefold way of knowing God is actually the occult philosophy in some ways divorced from sigil magic or whatever. And so I like that text a lot because I think it's the clearest actual expression of Agrippa's mystical and hermetic philosophy. And so in many ways you could call that the just the Agrippa's actual philosophical statement. And he edited that text, right? He wrote it early in Italy, re-edited it again in Antwerp, as he would like to do. And I would tell people that if you really want to get a vision into his actual mystical philosophy, that's the better text in many ways, because otherwise you have to go through every time that Agrippa wants to quote Pliny or he takes all these weird detours in the three books. But I think that text is actually the most succinct um, uh, statement of his actual philosophical ideas.
yeah, and something else that's really important about the three ways or the threefold way of knowing God is that anti-scholastic approach.
Well, yeah.
And again, this is not unique to Agrippa because you get it in Ficino is pretty hostile to scholastic theology in many ways. He's outside of the academy. Pico kind of is bridges that gap. He's in the academy. He is a scholastic schoolman in a way. He works as a schoolman, but he's also very much a humanist theologian at the same time. But Agrippa is a soldier by
Hmm.
trade and a very learned man, but one who's very hostile towards scholasticism. And yes, he's lecturing to schoolmen, but he has very horrible things to say about scholastic philosophy,
Oh, yeah.
which was very much a thing at the time. In the Renaissance, it seems there is a split between earlier humanists and later humanists. The earlier humanists are more conciliatory. They're more about playing nice with the schoolmen and trying to find a little bit of common ground. But once you get to Agrippa's time, uh all bets are off, and it's a full-scale war against scholasticism that you can see. He says it's a creation of the devil.
Oh, yeah. He calls dialectics satanic.
Yeah, he says that scholasticism and the scholastic method started with Satan, started with the serpent in the garden, and it's the serpent asking Eve all of these questiones,
Hmm.
and trying to fool her by asking her these questions and creating disputations. And so he really thinks that the prevalent method of knowledge production at the time was a creation of the devil, and it didn't lead to an enlightened society. It didn't lead to better faith or more faith. It led to a kind of skepticism in many ways, that but not the kind of skepticism that he's espousing,
Right.
but kind of just a cold, dry, rationalist logic chopping that did not move men's hearts, and it was far from the gospel. And what he saw was in the writings of the ancient church fathers, they wrote with very simple purity, simple piety, and that is just not what he could see in his own day among the schoolmen of the early 15th century or the early 16th century.
Right. I mean, he basically blames them for Protestantism. I mean, at some level, he's like, "This is the reason why there's all these heretics. It's that the church itself is self-destructing. It's like it's a sort of intellectual poverty or spiritual poverty born of a pseudo intellectualism, and of course, people are going to abandon this because it's not actual spirituality. And so I think that comes through very nicely in Agrippa, where he's on the reform ticket in many ways, but he wants this magical or quasi magical hermetic reform, which in many ways it's a pity that it never took, and no one seems to have really taken up that banner.
Yeah. And I mean, a lot of it is tied into as well this idea of the Prisca Theologia,
Hmm.
which again is not unique to Agrippa. You see it in Ficino and to some extent in Pico as well. And it is a kind of reaction against the academic climate of his time, where everything was based on disputation. Knowledge is produced through argumentation and disputes, and he just doesn't see that being the case. He
Right,
thinks that true knowledge is a matter of divine illumination,
right,
and you can't argue your way into divine illumination. So that's where that hermetic and Zoroastrian and Platonic and these kinds of influences flow in, because knowledge is not just produced by arguing about it. It really is something that is passed down to us by the grace of God.
right.
And the ancient theologians had it as a kind of pre-Christological theophany, and the of course the apostles had it, and people like pseudo Dionysius, or in his case Dionysius, who was a disciple of Paul in his mind, clearly had this divine illumination. And Lorenzo Valla had come up by this time with his theory that Dionysius was not the true disciple of Paul and was really a later theologian who had borrowed from Proclus. But that idea did not really pick up steam in Agrippa's time. Most people continued to believe in the ideas of that Dionysius really was the disciple of Paul, and that the Platonists were plagiarizing Dionysius and not the other way around.
Yeah, and I think that's another thing also, that there's a lot of pathos in these texts as well. And I think one of the places that I see that pathos is Agrippa's on admission that he has not experienced that illumination. That great letter, which is, I think, a really, to me, a touching letter,
It
is
was
that,
heart-wrenching for me.
it's really heart-wrenching, where he's admitting, and again, like, this is a private letter that ultimately gets published, but he's saying, as a soldier, I maybe have foregone it. I have blood on my hands, and I've lived this life, and I'm not going to get it. And what I can do, though, is I can stand at the gates and point people in that direction. It's an extremely touching kind of sincerity that often you don't get in writing of this time. That can be very pompous and very, let me tell you all the things that I know. Here's the truth of everything. Agrippa, you don't get that sense at all. That Agrippa really comes across in these writings as very frank and
Yeah.
very honest about what he knows and what he doesn't know. And I found that letter to be extremely touching.
And it also touches upon, a theme that was huge at the time between Protestantism and Catholicism,
Mhm.
between the idea that, how are we saved? Are we saved by grace alone, or are we saved by uh, grace in combination with works, working together with grace towards our salvation? And so Agrippa is a Roman Catholic, clearly, and he
I think we may have lost Dan. Well, folks, we'll wait for Dan to come back. I'll grab some questions. I know it's a super chat, so I'm going to make sure to grab these and thank folks for them. Um, yeah, I'll get Dan back in just a minute. Yeah, thank you, brother, for the super sticker, and thanks for picking up the book and being such a great supporter of the channel. I really appreciate that. Thank you. Um, let's see. I'll get a couple more. This was a great one. I'm sure Dan will have a lot of to say about it. But yeah, thank you. Yeah, one of the big things that came out of the Agrippa seminar was a desire to do some more work on Ficino, and I'm lucky to know Dan, and maybe in the future we'll do some specific targeted episodes on Ficino. I'd really love to do some content on Ficino, specifically on his commentaries on Plato's works, like the commentary on the Symposium and the Phaedrus, Those are extremely interesting, and so that will be a good place to dive into some of the more mystical elements of Ficino's thought. So definitely looking forward to that. A couple more. Thank you, Buttercup. It's a great name. No, appreciate that. Thank you. And Nestle, just thank you for all the folks who've actually bought the book. I really appreciate all the folks who've got it. I guess I should throw it in the throw a link in the chat for folks who want to get it. Man, like I said, Dan and I worked really hard on it, and really proud that we've been able to roll out basically hopefully a really important addition to understanding Renaissance Hermeticism and Renaissance thought in general. But yeah, there's a link to the book if folks want to pick it up. Let's see if there's any other questions I can grab before Dan gets back. This is an interesting question about why did the sort of Agrippan style reform along magical and hermetic lines, why did it not get really picked up? Yeah, I don't know that it was necessarily the Inquisition, because the Inquisition didn't, and there were many places where Agrippa was active, that like in Metz, where this ideas could have gotten picked up, and the Inquisition basically didn't function there. And so there were definitely parts where Protestantism or proto-Protestantism had really emerged, and I think it could have gotten picked up. I think it may have just been too esoteric. I think maybe one part of it, and I'd be curious to hear what Dan has to say when he gets back, that maybe it was too esoteric. Maybe it was just too heterodox, that it was leaning too heavily into the world of ancient paganism, of Kabbalah, and other things. And of course, remember that Agrippa himself had been accused very early in his career during his lectures on Reuchlin at the University of Dole, where he was basically accused of Judaizing and got in a great deal of trouble. So I think maybe it was just that it skirted too close to these quasi-heretical things to ever be terribly popular. But again, esoteric Christianity certainly did emerge. It didn't emerge directly out of Agrippa, but of course we have Jakob Böhme, we have the Rosicrucianism, we have Theosophy, Swedenborg, and other forms of esoteric Christianity, Martinism, of course, that have come. And so, in many ways, I would say that one of the things that could happen now is that those esoteric forms of Christianity could incorporate in a sort of backwards-looking way. They could reincorporate some of this more Agrippan style esotericism, hermeticism, and occultism into these still functioning esoteric forms of Christianity, and perhaps in Freemasonry and stuff like that. That's part of the reason why I'm excited about this book, is because it's giving people access to this Agrippan vision of an occult Christianity, that for people for whom Christianity is their spiritual path, their spiritual vocation, and who are also interested in hermetic or so-called occult ideas, it shows you that they're entirely compatible. They're entirely compatible. That there's an absolute way that one can be both a Christian and an esotericist, or being a Christian, even a Roman Catholic. And Agrippa was very staunchly Roman Catholic, very orthodox in his thinking, but also has this other mystical and hermetic dimension. And I don't think those two things are inimical. You don't get the sense that Agrippa was in any way negotiated or compromised his profound Christian identity. And so I think many people often come from Christianity. Now, I'll say this because I've met people who want to convert to Judaism because they want to have access to Kabbalah or something like that. And I tell them, look, Christians have an amazing mystical tradition all their own. And I would encourage people to hunt that down before they go converting to some other religion.
I'm back.
All right. Dan, you're back.
Sorry about that. My internet gave out.
No. It happens. It happens to the
Rogers.
best of us.
Don't ever use Rogers if you're Canadian.
I mean, I've never heard anyone say that. Basically, aside from like just having a fiber optic connection, everything seems terrible. I mean, I wish we could get
I
fiber optic
technically
too.
have that, so
Really? And still
yeah,
just the crap.
I've got the best internet you can get.
So it goes. But welcome back.
Thank you. Did I miss
Uh,
anything?
Talking a little bit, and there's a great question here that someone asked. I feel like you could jump into talking about Ficino. Um, so any
Yeah,
thoughts
sure.
on future Ficino stuff? And we can get back into talking about the book. I have a few other questions I want to get to, but I thought this was a uh, good question for you.
And there's no questions here, but I'm happy to see that I managed to change your graduation project, hopefully for the better. But yeah, there's so much to do in the world of Ficino studies, Pico studies, Agrippa, Reuchlin, what Justin you've been calling this magical reformation. I think that that's a good way of thinking about it. There is an element to which magic is somewhat overplayed in certain respects,
Mhm.
or maybe it's just what do you mean when you say magic,
Right.
right? That's always the question, because for these guys, magic is the sum of all knowledge. It's
Right.
basically the height of knowledge, so it may not necessarily be the kind of magic that we're accustomed to, using spirits and entities, the kind of things that you read in Francis Barrett's The Magus. It's more about ultimately achieving union with God is what they call magic, and they derive that from the idea that the Magi are the first magicians, and they are priests of Ahura Mazda, and they are ultimately knowledgeable in sacred things, and that's what the magic of Ficino, the magic of Pico, that's what they're talking about. So
Right.
I
So, I mean, I
find
think
that
Agrippa even calls it, I think, at one point, that magic is theology made practical. It's the practical dimension of theology.
yeah,
So it's a
and
practice of theology.
Agrippa or Reuchlin also has something
Mhm.
of this as well. The only issue is that, again, they're talking about a kind of intellectual assent to God. And so the practical is theoretical in a kind of way.
Right.
Um, because if it's too practical, then it's more about goal seeking. And,
Mhm.
if you listen to someone like Stephen Skinner talk about magic, he'll say, look, magic is about getting spirits to do stuff for
Yeah.
you. It's
Yeah.
about tangible results. We can talk about mysticism, we can talk about magic. Those are two different things. Magic is about getting results, and there's an extent to which these Renaissance guys are trying to get results, but they are spiritual results
Mhm.
ultimately.
Yeah,
Um,
and I think this is also a thing too that Agrippa often gets sort of lumped in, and Francis Barrett's The Magus is, I think, really responsible for this, where he gets lumped in with that kind of use spirits to get stuff magic, and Agrippa had nothing good to say about that. I mean, he was very Renaissance in the sense of he's distancing himself from what he perceived to be sort of corrupt, degenerated, medieval, now we would call medieval magic, grimoire magic, and Agrippa had basically nothing to say with it. And it's funny because even as soon as he died and the Opera Omnia is published, it's the three books of occult philosophy are published with all these other grimoires that he would have detested. So that thread had already been lost even upon his death.
yeah, and you see this tension in Ficino as well,
Mhm.
where you have the three books on life, which is a commentary, it begins as a commentary on Plotinus, but it's really this mirror for princes kind of literature to help his patron, Lorenzo de' Medici, with scholar's sickness, with this kind of saturnine melancholy that overtakes you when you are too heavily involved in scholarly pursuits, and how you can change that for the better. And he extracts a bunch of material from the Picatrix, and he has all kinds of magical prescriptions, but then he gets accused by his contemporaries of being a sorcerer in certain
Mhm.
ways. So he has to write his apologia and saying that, look, this is uh, priests and astrologers were the same thing in antiquity, and that's what I'm doing. I'm a priest, I'm an astrologer, and what I do is for the good of mankind, for health, for for wealth and well-being and these sorts of things, and I have no truck with the more malefic elements of magic.
Right.
um, and so, there are a lot of people who will read that and say, oh, is he really being sincere, or is this just he's just covering himself, uh, so that he doesn't get in trouble with the Inquisition and things like this? And I really do think that these men were sincere. I don't think that it was
I
just a
agree.
big cover up. I think that's a theory that people have, but I do not personally subscribe to it. I think that these men really were devout in their Catholicism, and it's
Mhm.
not just a cover, uh, even if it may seem like that from some of their writings.
Yeah. I mean, I think Agrippa's closer to that by 1533, to that. I think he's more comfortable than Ficino was with that kind of uh, magic, the operative magic. But yeah, I also think that he really intellectually wanted to skirt that line as close as possible to avoid, um, to avoid that. I mean, he says as much. I mean, he says like, yeah, summoning spirits and stuff is like it's always a bad idea. Like, don't do that. So yeah, I think I agree. I don't believe it was some. This was all smoke and mirrors for them secretly.
Yeah.
Because even in his letters privately, the thread is always this sort of hermetic illuminatory magic, and not something else. I guess
Yeah.
another question I was going to ask, or maybe get that thought in, but the other question I was going to ask is, how did you find reading Agrippa's Latin? I say that when I was just sight translating it, it was refreshing. It's a really he's a his Latinity is actually very nice. I found, and remarkably clear compared to, I don't know how it is for you, but when I'm reading these medieval grimoires, it's just like horrible. They're just throwing demonstratives and random words in there because they don't have any command of the grammar. And I think, I don't know how you experience it, but these grimoires take themselves so seriously, but they're sometimes only quasi literate, and they sound so pompous, and it's somehow also very ridiculous because the grammar is so bad that when I was reading Agrippa, I was like, oh my god, this is such a refreshing thing than having to read whatever the Munich Necromancer's Manual that's just really garbled, incoherent Latin. But you're far more experienced with that than I am. I was wondering your experience of his Latinity.
So with Agrippa, I find that it's similar to what I experienced in Ficino, which is that the Renaissance humanists, for all they cherished good classical Latinity, really do have a foot in both worlds,
Hmm.
in the medieval material that preceded them and in the resurrection of the classics. And so it really depends that you can see like a shift in the tone and in the use of grammar and in the vocabulary, that at times when they're dealing with more practical material, it's almost like reading Jerome's translation of the Bible. Like it's very simple, and I would attribute that more to a kind of medieval kind of Latin where you say what you mean and you mean what you say. You're not speaking in strings of metaphors and similes and things of that sort, or expressions, figures of speech, those kinds of things. So there's a bit of that, the simpler kind of Latin at times, but then at other times, depending on the context, you get these rhetorical fireworks,
Hmm.
where it really is trying to crank the flowery language up a notch. So, for example, the Pavian oration I find was very much, it's an oration, so it is very flowery in the language, and he's drawing on all of the different figures of rhetoric that he can use, and he's using all kinds of classical allusions, and the language really is trying to the best of his ability, echo the speeches of a Cicero or
Right.
a Demosthenes. And so that style is much harder to translate. Of
Hmm.
course, it takes a lot more time. It's a lot slower. You've got to really use your dictionary, and for as long as I've been doing Latin, it doesn't matter. I still have to work really closely with a dictionary, because words don't just mean one thing. Often words mean 5, 10 things. And you may not know that that word is being used in that particular sense until you look it up in the dictionary and find the way that a word is used. And that's why it's important to have a good classical dictionary that has all of the usages of a word,
Right.
not just a definition, but how words were used in antiquity and in what speeches. Because if we know or have a decent sense of what kind of words Agrippa is using, or what kind of works he was reading, then we can get a sense of where he's drawing the way that he's using these words. And
Right.
so it was interesting in that you would sometimes have smooth sailing for a few pages, and then you would hit a paragraph where it really gets a lot harder, because it becomes a lot more classical. It uses a lot more um, expressions and doesn't necessarily just speak in a straightforward way, but tries to show how learned he is and try to really use all the figures of rhetoric that he can possibly squish into a paragraph. And I love that stuff because I love studying rhetoric and I'm interested in that, but that doesn't make it easy. It really does take some time to hash it out and figure it out. But I found the letters to be particularly more simple.
Yeah.
They are humanist letters ultimately, but they're not too bad in terms of understanding and translating them. But other works, it depends. Like it kind of jumps back and forth in its difficulty.
Yeah, I mean, it also made it clear to me that reading, having had my eyes on Agrippa both in translation but also in Latin, it also made it really clear that the fourth book is not written by him. I
Oh
don't know if
yeah,
you've looked at the Latin of that, but yeah, it was like it was interesting that was ever a debate at all. You look at the Agrippa's Latinity is relatively coherent, and he has a certain style, and you look at the fourth book, and you're like, this is definitely not written by the same person.
well, and it's just like, why would there be a section on geomancy in the fourth book when he dealt with that in the first book? Stuff like that makes you wonder. Uh, and pseudepigraphically attributed works happen all the
All the
time in
time.
this
Yeah.
period, especially for Agrippa or Paracelsus. I feel like Paracelsus is like ground zero for
Oh yeah.
the pseudepigraphically attributed works.
Right. Maybe
Um,
all the magical works were there's good theories to believe that most of the magical works and that are attributed to Agrippa or Paracelsus were not written by him.
yeah, I'm open to arguments to say that it's Agrippa, but I've just from what I've seen, I have no reason to believe that the fourth book is actually by Agrippa.
Yeah. And also the magic doesn't make sense. It's not Agrippa's magic. Like that's the other thing. I guess the other thing Maya was wondering is any surprises in the translation? Anything that jumped out at you as like a moment or anything particularly surprising?
How hermetic it
Yeah.
was the surprise.
Yeah, that's why I reached out
Um,
to you. That also struck me as like immediately when I was reading, I was like, "Holy crap!" And the fact that there's all this interest in Hermeticism, and yet that text has remained these texts have remained basically under the radar is really surprising to me.
yeah, and you can't know that it's hermetic unless you've read it in the Latin and realize that he is quoting Latin Hermetica,
Hmm.
right? If you're just reading Brian Coe, and this is why I made an effort to put in all of the footnotes every time there was a reference to the Corpus Hermeticum. I put in a reference to Brian Copenhaver's English translation in the footnotes, so you could just see it right there. The issue with that, of course, is that Copenhaver is working from a Greek translation of the Corpus Hermeticum, other than the Asclepius, which is another work I'm very, very familiar with because I've got an edition of that coming out or a translation of that coming out in a Latin Hermetica collection. But yeah, it was like every other line had a reference that was an allusion to the Corpus Hermeticum.
Hmm.
And if you just read the Corpus Hermeticum in English, you wouldn't know. But if you can see it in the Latin and you can see it in Agrippa's Latin, then it becomes really clear that, oh, he's drawing this particularly from Ludovico Lazzarelli.
Right.
And yeah, so that was a big surprise to me, was how hermetic it was. And, you know, it's not a surprise to me, but it's probably a surprise to a lot of people, is the extent to which something can be hermetic and Christian at the
Hmm.
same time. that's probably going to be quite shocking to a lot of people, depending on what they think Hermeticism is at this time period. If they think it's more the practical Hermetica, um, in my case, it's just works attributed to Hermes Trismegistus. It's clear that he's quoting directly from the Corpus Hermeticum at length. He's not really quoting, you know, the Liber Hermetis or whatever. He's not quoting those works. He's quoting the Poimandres, those sorts of works that you find in what we call the Corpus Hermeticum today. So that was surprising. And then, it's fascinating to me how Kabbalah and Hermeticism sort of bleed together in Agrippa. Often we like to treat these as separate things, and they are separate things to a certain extent. But in the Renaissance, they really do come together, especially in Agrippa. Whereas even in Pico, you see a clear distinction. When he talks about Kabbalah, he's talking about Kabbalistic conclusions over here. Then you have Hermetic conclusions over here, and they're divided into two different categories. But Agrippa is much more poetic, and he brings it all together in a kind of one neatly tied together package. And so that was very interesting.
And
And
I
yeah,
think also these Italian period works are very important for, I think, part of the reason that we've inherited this weird dichotomy when people talk about Agrippa, that either he's the mystic or the skeptic, and the people have spent a bunch of ink trying to one argue for one of those or somehow make sense of them together. And to me, like when I actually read these middle works, these are the connective tissue that make it clear like how both are actually functioning together. And that, Mark Vanderpoel and some other people have made that point. Wouter Hanegraaff have made that point, I think. But I think that it becomes most clear in these texts how Agrippa is negotiating those two positions and why those positions are actually logical correlatives. And seeing him developing that stuff is, I think, also very important, because there is a kind of weird staccato transition if you go from just reading the skeptical work and reading the 1533. These two things don't make any sense in relationship to each other. But I think that seeing his thought as it develops is, and also for me, like this so-called paradox is not a paradox at all. This is a totally apparent problem of the way that we encounter Agrippa in translation, not actually born of the actual dynamism of his intellect.
yeah. Something else that really surprised me was how heavily the fact that he was a soldier
Mhm.
weighed on him. He spills a lot of ink,
Yeah.
uh, defending himself, apologizing for, explaining away the fact that he is a military man and that he served in the army and that he probably killed some people, although he doesn't really talk about that very much. But you almost get the sense of like, I know post traumatic stress disorder is a modern term, and it's a modern kind of concept that we can't easily retroject that onto the past. But you almost get the sense that he was traumatized by war in a certain way and felt deeply ashamed of his involvement with the military. Maybe not ashamed, because he is still bootlicking in a way
Sure.
his superiors and the generals and the people that he served in the army with. But he really does feel an insecurity in the fact that he was a soldier and he's not some doctor theologian from the schools, and that he should feel kind of ashamed for standing up on the podium and lecturing to people who are much more distinguished theologians than he is on these kinds of theological matters, like uh, on the wisdom and power of God,
Mhm.
this work of the Corpus Hermeticum. And so that was really interesting. And that I never saw that really in his other writings. It didn't come out until I read the Pavian oration. And so he spends a lot of time on that, and then not so much time talking about Hermes. So it's it's what survives of those orations. We don't have the bulk of it, but I think that the way that we organize the work works well, because you have the Pavian oration, where he defends himself for being a soldier and teaching theology, and then he works on, or then he talks about Hermes Trismegistus, who he was, and he's getting a lot of this material either from Ficino or from Morianus, this Liber Alchemiae. You've got the three Hermes hypothesis with Abu Mashar and so forth. And then we don't actually get his lectures on Hermeticism or on the Corpus Hermeticum because they don't survive.
Right.
But we get the on the threefold way of knowing God, and that's a thoroughly Hermetic work. And so it works nicely as an introduction and segue into that work. And then we have the letters, and then after the letters we have the material on that's from the De Vanitate, and that stuff as well shows a kind of nuanced position on magic. And I think
Right.
that the way that the book flows nicely. They're disjointed works, they're written decades apart at times, but I think that it creates a kind of coherent
Mm-hmm.
narrative about Agrippa's life. So that was a pleasant surprise.
Yeah, it was surprising to me also that there's a great unity to his thinking. That from the 1510 draft all the way through the 1533, that there's, he has the acts. He has like this illumination felicity arc, and that is the angle, and like he grinds on that angle. And again, like we're often taught, and I was even taught that there's this weird Agrippa paradox, and when you actually again look at this material, it's like, no, there's a profound unity to his thinking there. And typically, I often find that kind of unity born out of mystical experiences. Someone's had a radical experience. Descartes is a great example. Descartes had a mystical experience and basically spent his entire life writing and rewriting the exact same book. Agrippa is doing something similar. He's deepening his thinking, but he doesn't have that anchor in experience, at least so far as we can tell. And I don't know. I found that to be also be an interesting thing, that there was that while his philosophy deepened over time, there wasn't some kind of weird disjunction that sometimes we get told exists in his philosophy. So that was also interesting, just to see like, oh yeah, this guy is like grinding, and that was yeah, that was I don't know, for me that was an interesting aspect of looking at this material.
Yeah, and not just Agrippa being united in his own thought, but also just the whole tradition of Platonic Christianity stemming out of Augustine, stemming out of Dionysius. I feel like there's a really profound unity
Hmm.
to the Augustinian tradition
Right.
that goes, from Augustine through the Middle Ages. Saint Augustine's, one of the most quoted, most copied authors in all of Christian history. I think there's like 800 or more manuscripts of the City of God.
Yep.
And uh, Ficino, Pico, all of these guys are all very familiar with Augustine, and Agrippa is no exception. And I think that his ultimate philosophy, his mysticism, is really wrapped up in this Augustinian spirituality. And
Right.
I think that in order to understand Agrippa clearly, you need to have a good grasp on what Augustine was getting at in not only the Confessions, but in the City of God as well.
Yeah.
Especially this hierarchy of beings, and that God is the highest good, and that it is a deficiency of the will to seek for goods from lower goods down that hierarchical chain. So we need to redirect our will and our attention and our reason back up to the highest good. And that is the source of our felicitas, of our eternal, supreme, boundless, never-ending joy. And so I think that that's really an important part of the puzzle, is how profoundly Augustinian Agrippa
Right.
is in many ways.
Yeah.
And it's kind of
Yeah.
like right in front of you the whole time,
Yeah.
or it seems so like normy that, like, yeah, of course a Latin Christian is influenced by Augustine, but it's interesting how many different ways that can manifest.
Right. It's because we don't read Augustine, really. Very few of us are reading. I always tell people, if you're interested in Western esotericism, you have to read on the City of God. Like that is a crucially important text in the history of the development of esoteric spirituality in the West. Especially if you want to understand magic and how, what role, if any, magic's going to play. And I think another character that's also looming large in Agrippa and in this tradition is Nicholas of Kuza. and the whole learned ignorance tradition. And I think that that is also another aspect of the mystical dimension of Agrippa's thought is very much wrapped up in this learned ignorance tradition, and that's also a place where it's also a place where Hegel was influenced. The dialectical process like coming to knowledge via negation is a crucially important part of Nicholas of Kuza, which I also see is very much underwriting a lot of the so-called Agrippan skepticism. So
Yeah.
that's another character again that I think gets mentioned, but doesn't get the kind of airplay I think that they. Again, I think we need to be reading those kind of characters if we want to understand uh, Western esoteric spirituality.
Yeah, though I think again, all of that stuff is really downstream from Dionysius.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
And Dionysius is the real font of
Yeah.
all of that. I mean, and you have the Cappadocian Fathers as well, but Dionysius was more well known in the West thanks to the translations of Erugena, um, and commentaries by all kinds of
Sure.
different authors, Albert the Great, Thomas Aquinas. Then you get in the immediate Renaissance, Ficino was working on Dionysius, Pico was working on Dionysius. On being in unity or on being in the one is an extremely Dionysian work, and it's all about this cloud of unknowing or the gloom of unknowing, and how we need to climb into this cloud of not being able to actually know what God is because he's so beyond the human intellect.
Right.
And that really is the true pathway to knowing God. And that's, in Bonaventure, it's in all kinds of different medieval theologians. So it's not like it went dormant throughout the Middle Ages and then was resurrected in the Renaissance. It was always there.
Right. It was a
And so
question of
that's
emphasis.
something that I would stress, and it's something that I stressed in my dissertation, is the continuity throughout the Middle Ages
Mhm.
is often sacrificed at the expense of change and novelty, when really these themes had been around for centuries and centuries.
Right. Yeah, and again, so again, the Mystical Theology by Pseudo Dionysius is one of those texts where you would never imagine that basically a 5-page essay could transform the direction of Western theology. But it's one of these weird texts, like say for Yetzirah, you would never imagine that this weird little book would have such an enormous impact. Um, um, yeah, but it's funny that again, if you look at the mystical theology, that text punches way above its weight. Well worth reading, well worth studying very deeply.
Hmm.
Um, let's talk maybe a little bit about why we published it the way that we did, and this is where we drift into a bit more controversial territory because what we didn't do is we did not follow what we're supposed to do in some ways, which is basically to get this peer reviewed and then pitched to an academic publisher. And I've been really adamant about the fact that I'm deeply what's the right word? I have real problem.
Disillusioned.
Yeah, disillusioned is maybe the one word. Militantly opposed to. I don't know. I have a lot of bad things to say about academic publishing, but yeah, I mean, what was your thinking? When we were sort of batting this idea around about publishing it ourselves. That comes with some advantages and it comes with some disadvantages. But I don't know. Maybe you want to speak a little bit more about your experience with academic publishing and what maybe another way of putting this is what should people know about academic publishing that when they pick up a book from whatever Brill or Penn State or Oxford or whatever, what are people not seeing behind the scenes that perhaps they should know about?
Right. So, I mean, first and foremost, I am an academic.
Mhm.
So I have been brought up in the academy. Lots of my friends are academics. And so nothing that we're going to say here is really a knock against those people. It's not a knock against their methodologies, which are sound for the most part. And it's not even a knock against the people who work in publishing, many of whom are great, fine people.
Mhm.
But the problem is that as a system, it is run like a giant racket or a scam, because you as an academic are expected to, as the saying goes, publish or perish. You are expected to have a certain level of scholarly output, and that scholarly output goes towards your review for whether you get a job, whether you get hired. And then once you have been hired, it goes towards whether you are going to be accepted for tenure and promotions and these sorts of things. So you have to publish, and that's fine in a certain way. The problem is that you have to publish peer reviewed work. And again, the peer review process is important. We need experts to vet each other's work to make sure that what they're doing is quality work. But the problem there is that nobody's getting paid for any of this.
Mhm.
You're not getting paid to do peer review, and you're not getting paid to publish any of your work. So you can work for years, months, decades on a particular project. And at the end of the road, what you have to do is sign a contract that essentially gives you 2% of your uh, gross income, or of the profits that you make. So you are signing away all of the potential profits, if you are even going to have profits. And that's another thing, is that everybody who's an academic usually works on a very, very narrow, specialized area. And so I was telling you earlier, you can be working on 11th century agricultural history in the writings of Egbert von Bergerberg, and nobody's going to read that. Nobody's going to buy it. The people who are going to buy it are libraries,
Mhm.
and the libraries have deals with publishers to buy their books and to always be subscribed to buying the latest and greatest academic material, so that they can be a well-stocked university library. So when I publish a book with a university press, it's not being sold at a reasonable price for people to just consume. It's being sold at a very inflated price for university research libraries to purchase. And there's maybe what, like at most 2,000 libraries who are going to buy this book. So you're really doing it for an audience of 2,000 people who are going to buy the book if it's not a popular topic. Um, and then you get into the factors that you mentioned in your video when you announced our book, that a lot of this is funded by taxpayer dollars. So the inflated prices are being, they're being bought, or the prices are inflated. The books are being bought by libraries, which are using tax dollars to buy those things. And that money is not going to the people who make the book, it's going to the publishers.
Mhm.
And often those publishers are asking authors for um, publishing, what are they called? Like, they're asking for extra money to keep the price of the book low. So if I publish a book, I need to secure money from the University of Waterloo through a kind of grant to keep the price of the book lower than, let's say, $150. And I already know that nobody's going to buy the book, because it's going to be, even with that publishing subsidy, that's the word I was looking for, that'll bring it down to $100. And who buys a book for $100, especially when you can just hop on libgen and download that book? Someone's going to pirate it somewhere along the way, and people can just get those books for free. And so between all of those factors, the fact that you have to publish, but then you don't get any money for it, where you get an extremely small amount. Um, and yes, as Joe Peterson says here, academic publishing also adds huge delays. And I can attest to that. I mean, it takes me like 3 years to work through a given project. And that's because the press has to take it in, they have to send it out to peer reviewers who they're not paying. And then they have to get people to volunteer their time for that. And it's dysfunctional in a whole lot of ways. And so there are strengths to this method. Peer review is important. I think that peer review can actually still happen outside of academia by people reviewing books. Simple enough. Like, you don't need to have a double blind study, like the double blind method of peer review for it to be effective peer review. Like if Joe Peterson reads our book and finds some mistakes in it or finds things that he thinks would be improved, and he writes us a letter and we go, thanks, I'll add that in the next edition when I review the work or whatnot. That's another thing, is if you want to do subsequent editions, it's got to be justified. The presses need to have enough profit from that book being sold in order to justify getting a second edition out. Whereas when you're self-publishing, you can just pump out a second edition whenever you want.
Yeah.
There's nothing stopping you.
And also, I'll say this about peer review. While I think peer review is very important, often it's not blind. Basically, every time I've published academically, I've known who my peer reviewers were. Like I didn't know exactly, but because the field is only 5 people.
It's a small world.
Yeah, like you know everybody who's, if you publish an article on Agrippa or on John Dee, I know the 5 John Dee people. And like when I published with Aries, which is printed by Brill, when I published in Aries, I knew that, Shoney and Klukless and those guys, of course, those are the guys are going to be the guys, so yeah, so I think that we should be more honest about the fact that the peer review process and it also could be monkeyed around. I know of a scholar who was reporting to me yesterday of a process in which they were basically just like vetoed every time they tried to do something because one peer reviewer just disliked them, and they had to write to the editor and be like, hey, look, if this person's peer reviewing my stuff, could you please ask them to not, because this person just doesn't like me. And so the process can also be hijacked by bad actors in ways that obviously are unfortunate. So, but yeah, I'm not against, when people hear me say bad things about the academic publishing industry, I think that there are important things that are good about it, but also I think that it's extremely exploitative. Another aspect of it that I think is exploitative, is it makes the assumption that you're basically a tenured professor, and that publishing is just a thing you can do just as a part of your existence. But the truth of the matter is that tenure largely doesn't exist for the vast majority of academics, and therefore any labor that they do over and against their teaching load, that's just uncompensated labor. There is no university position for them where they're getting compensated fairly as part of the package of that. And so I think that academic publishing imagines a world of academics basically whose existence is subsidized through the university system, and that's increasingly just not true. So I think that's another aspect of it that I think, that the ship could be righted in those kinds of ways. Even if you were able to, have intellectual rights to your work, if you could publish it via Brill and it undergo the peer review process, and then it does that, but you could also publish it yourself on, Amazon or whatever, to give people access to a cheaper version. But then you almost always have to sign your intellectual property rights away when you publish with someone else, which is, again, that sounds like a cartel to me. That does not sound like an institution who's actually trying to do the business of education, because education, it should be accessible, I think, by definition. And then the finances of it become, I think, to my mind, objectively gatekeeping.
Yeah. Though ultimately, there's no way to publish a book without giving away your rights.
Right.
That's
Sure.
just part of it.
Right.
As soon as unless you are, printing the book in your bedroom and like binding them together in your bedroom, you're giving away your rights somewhere along the line.
Sure.
And there are, some people, you give your rights away to them and they'll let you keep 60% of the revenue. Most people will give you 2%,
right,
5% at absolute most.
Absolute most. And I think I was talking to Angela Puka, and she's getting exactly 0% for her book that she published with Brill.
What?
Exactly 0. Yeah, oh yeah. Like, I mean, I published articles. You don't pay anything for that.
Yeah, I mean, the articles is a whole other thing.
Yeah, and so I don't get anything for that. But yeah, I think Brill gave her exactly 0%. Um,
Oh, you're also at the mercy of their publication teams.
mhm.
So if they don't necessarily like the book that you published, if it doesn't meet certain criteria that they want to see promulgated into the world, they just won't advertise your book, and it will kind of just go to a research library and sit there and collect some dust. And they won't even bother to put a tweet out about it. So there's always that as well.
Yeah,
So when you self-publish, you're the one who has to advertise, and you have to do the interviews, and you have to put the tweets out and make the YouTube videos and so on and so forth. And they expect you to do that too when you publish for them.
sure. Oh yeah,
But again, you're not. There's no incentive for it because you're not getting any cut of the profits, or such a negligible cut that it ultimately amounts to nothing.
yeah. So this is what I mean. Again, people should know this, right? When and if you do buy a book from an academic publishing house, and it is $80, uh, the most important thing to know about that is that the author of that book is basically getting nothing.
And they didn't
Um,
set the price.
yeah, and they didn't set the price.
So I see people complaining all the time, like, "Oh, Wouter Hanegraaff's new book is way too expensive." He didn't set that price. Like, he
Right.
had nothing to do with it. So you can't lay that blame at the foot of the authors, because it's really not it's not their faults in any way,
Right. Yeah, they're
and
not.
they
They're
are doing it because it's part of being an academic. You have to do it if you want to. When you get your tenure review, or when you're looking to get a job, they want to have people working at the universities who are well published and are respected scholars in their fields. And so, yeah, it's fraught with a whole bunch of problems.
right. Right. So I mean, how? And this is I think, an interesting question. We didn't subject this to peer review, so why should people trust us? What did we do to keep ourselves? How do you maintain your standards? I mean, I have some sense of how I do it, but
Yeah, I'm
why not just cut and paste it into Google Translate?
well, that's why I put the Latin there on the page.
Yeah.
That's really the reason why we did the facing Latin and English translation. Uh, if I were doing this with an actual press, they would never want that facing Latin and English, because it would amount to too many pages, making the book too expensive. That would eat into their profits. They wouldn't want that. Of course, there are some uh, academically published books that do have facing Latin and English translation, but for the most part, publishers don't even necessarily want to do translations.
Right.
Translations are not really looked upon with very great respect. They want monographs. They
Right.
want like books that have come out of your mind, like Athena fully springing out of Zeus's head, fully equipped. They don't want translations, and that goes against the kind of principles that I've been after, which is going back to the sources, making the sources available to people. That's really what I'm passionate about. Um, so I've put the source there for people to read. If I've made mistakes, I'm happy to hear from people that they have an alternate reading. And so that's one way that we can be kept honest. But realistically, when it comes to the daily grind of doing the project, it's all the same methodology, all the same kind of work
Okay.
that I would do in my academic work. If you open Ficino, or you open Picatrix, or you open any of these other books, you'll see it's the same kind of footnoting, the same style, Chicago Manual of Style, or what have you, in terms of the citations. There's bibliographies, there's footnotes. It's all the same methodology. It goes into it. So there's that. Um, what else?
I think also we put our name on it. Like we're not we have pretty large audiences, and I know about you, but I take my reputation pretty seriously. I take when it's really easy to lose a good reputation, and by sticking our name on it, we're basically sticking our reputation on, saying we really tried hard to do this with the utmost scholarly intent and integrity, and I'm sure the same is true for you. I just care about it. I want to do it well both because I don't want my reputation tarnished, but also I want to do it well because I care. Like doing scholarly work matters to me, and also this is maybe a weird aspect to it as well. But I don't know. I feel like Agrippa doesn't get the respect that he deserves. That he gets sort of he's a name that gets dropped, and he's a people are happy to take images from the book or something and use it as whatever. But I feel like as a philosopher, he doesn't really get the the attention he deserves, and that's another aspect of it as well. Like I want people to get contact with this important mystic and philosopher, and the only way they're going to do that is if we get a reliable edition in their hands. So those are some of the other elements that also are motivating me.
Yeah. And for me as well, this to me comes out of, in a way, my PhD project.
Hmm.
So I was well primed by doing this PhD on Pico and Ficino to look at Agrippa, especially the works that were very similar in content and in theme to what those men were publishing.
Right.
And so it was kind of just like a natural outgrowth. In fact, there were a lot of times where I was going back to my dissertation and pulling some stuff out and looking for certain things. And I initially, when I was writing the PhD, I thought I might get to Agrippa, and then it ended up the dissertation started getting way too big, so I had to put an end to it somewhere, and I ended it in 1499, which is when Ficino passes away, and so that was kind of my cutoff. But my project on Arcangelo of Borgonovo, that's easily picks up where the dissertation left off, and it's the same with this particular project as well. And so to me, it was kind of just more of the daily grind that I had been doing for 5 years working on the PhD, anyways. And so, yeah, it's the same methodologies, the same approach that I took to doing the PhD, which I did it as rigorously as possible. I also put that kind of love and attention and care into this work.
Yeah, and it shows. I mean, I think again, and also, the other thing is that if we do come back and eventually do the other Agrippa texts, we can always add to them and change things around. And it's the case that we're definitely not done with Agrippa. There needs to be a whole edition. There's so much more to do, and I guess that leads into this question from Phil.
Oh,
Uh,
hi, Phil.
yeah, he was just hanging out in office hours earlier. Other potential book projects. We were kind of talking about this off camera. Other, you got your Arcangelo project, but yeah,
Yeah.
what do you imagine elsewise?
So I have stuff in the pipeline right now. I have this project on Arcangelo, which is going to take a long time. It's a 700-page commentary on Pico della Mirandola's Kabbalistic conclusions. And so that's, almost like 3 books in and of itself. And then I've got this Latin Hermetica collection that I've been working on for 3 years with Brett Bartlett and David Pareca and Matteo Stefani. So it's um, the Asclepius, the Latin Asclepius, based on a new 2019 critical edition. That's a complete critical edition, so it's not based on the Noc Festugière edition that Brian Copenhaver was working with. So that'll be a new translation, and then that's also accompanied with the Book of the Six Principles of Things, which is a Hermetic work from the Middle Ages, the Glossae Super Trismegistum, which is a medieval scholastic commentary on the Asclepius, and the Book of 24 Philosophers and commentaries. So that's coming out with Breppels, and it's been sent off for peer review, and we're awaiting that. Who knows how long that will take? But so I already have kind of my work cut out for me. I'm halfway or almost most of the way there for a lot of these projects, but because of how slow it is, uh, it's hard to say exactly when that stuff will come out. We also have a translation of the Uranomachia that's basically done, but we're not sure what to do with it, and we're not sure if we wanted to translate the Metromachia and sell them as a bundle. So the Uranomachia is the astrologer's game. It's like a board game that is designed to teach you the fundamentals of astrology. And so it's from the Elizabethan era. William Folk is the author. And the problem, too, is that we were wondering, do we want to just sell this as a text, or do we want to actually get a board game publisher involved and create a whole board game? The board that you need for it needs to be quite large, so that's another logistical issue. So we don't know if we want to tread into those weeds. Like, I'm more of a texts guy. I'm not huge on the business side of things. And so that kind of becomes a problem where you're dealing with board game companies and trying to get rights and that sort of thing. That's not my forte. So those are some projects that I have in the pipeline. And then, of course, staying on top of all the other YouTube stuff
Mhm.
and teaching, and I'm a sessional instructor. So right now I'm teaching a class on medieval studies. I've got some classes on my Patreon from recent semesters that I've taught. One on medieval heresies and one on Greek and Roman religion. And so I'm always busy doing stuff. But in the book world, those really are the projects that I'm looking at. And then probably at some point we may want to do another collection of Agrippan texts, because there's just so many other texts left to translate. It's just a matter of getting texts that people are interested in. I know that his commentaries on Raymond Lull interest me. I don't know how many people are interested in Raymond Lull, though. So
Right.
that's
And then you have to really know the Ars Brevis to really get
yeah,
into his him and Bruno both wrote commentaries on it, which and um, yeah, I'm also interested in his take on the Ars Brevis, because it also is the idea that that he's okay with this sort of computational way of generating knowledge, but he doesn't like scholastic dialectics. Fascinates me, and so I'm curious how he squares that circle.
yeah. We've also been tossing around the idea of looking at various Kabbalistic works from
Mm.
the Renaissance. So there's all kinds of stuff that can be done that hasn't been done. Uh, and I think you and I would work really well together on some of that material. You know, not saying that we're going to do this because we haven't really hashed it out, but things like the De Verbo Mirifico by Reuchlin
Right.
hasn't ever been translated. So that's something that's worthwhile.
Yep.
Athanasius Kircher has tons of stuff that needs to be translated.
Yep.
I would not try to do all of it. That's just way too much.
Yeah, Guillaume
But
Postel, we mentioned. Yeah, like
yeah,
Guillaume Postel, so it's like some Kabbalistic stuff. Yeah, a
yeah,
text
and
I would
so
love to work on. Actually, I just got a copy of it and on auction. This is an interesting text that not many people know about. It's called the Asis Rumim, the fruit of the pomegranate, and it's a very important praesis of Cordovero's.
hmm,
Uh, and so Cordovero's book is massive, but this is much more manageable. You know, it's a relatively small book, but thinking about if I were to sit down and do a translation from Hebrew of the Asis Rumim, it would, because the Ramak's Kabbalah is completely unavailable in English, and so this will be a way of translating something that's a bit briefer than the Pardes, but that would also be an interesting project to branch out into actual Hebrew primary texts. So
yeah.
that's another idea that
Well,
I think
and
that's important.
we've been floating around also the potential for maybe a collection, like a
Mhm.
source book. That could also be an interesting project. One of my favorite source books that really got me interested in all the stuff that I'm interested in is Marvin Meyer has a
Oh,
source
yeah.
book on mystery cults, and it's just got excerpts of texts from antiquity on all the different mystery cults. So you've got section on cult of Isis, section on the cult of Dionysus, section on the cult of Mithras, and so on and so forth. It'd be really interesting to make a textbook or source book like that, which is just a collection of texts that are related to Renaissance Hermeticism, Kabbalah,
Mhm.
magic, and so forth, without having to be exhaustive and translate every single thing. Like commit to a whole text. You can commit to a couple pages per author and put that into a collection and see where that goes. So that's also a potential project for the future. So who knows?
Yeah, there's a lot. There's a lot to one. There's a lot to be done, and two, the so far the success of this project, which I've been really happy about and really thankful for. Folks, and there are a lot of folks who've bought this book, and I'm really, really have a lot of gratitude for everyone who's bought it and who's going to read it. But the one of the great things about that is that it's a great predictor for future texts. So if this sells well, it'll be a good idea to say, hey, look, if we do something else, maybe we can keep this going. But yeah, I would be really excited to do this, because I think also you and I share a love of especially Renaissance mysticism and Renaissance philosophy that I think part of the reason why it doesn't get the attention is because people don't really know it very well, and a lot of the texts aren't available. And I think even in philosophy, you have this sort of bias that it's just Catholic theology basically, and that's just not true. It's a very distinct kind of thinking that that I think doesn't get the attention it deserves in sort of the study of esotericism in general.
Yep.
Um, Let me see. There's the last couple questions. If folks have questions about the Agrippa project or just questions for Dan and I, happy to take questions for just a little bit. I have we have a little bit of time. But
I
I think
will
I
say
saw.
something too before we turn to
Sure.
questions, is that we welcome reviews. We didn't have it peer reviewed, but you are our peers, and we welcome reviews from people. So if you enjoyed the book, or didn't enjoy the book for whatever reason, as long as it's a good reason, then we want to hear we want to hear it from you. So please do consider writing reviews, even if they're just very brief. Um, we do really appreciate that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, and also, this is a great opportunity to read. I think Eric Purdue has a fantastic translation of the three books. I think it's really important to read the three books and then immediately open our book and read the epilogue that was originally there in the 1533 edition, because that, I mean, I don't know for you, Dan, but leaving that epilogue off dramatically transforms how that text hits. And whether it was Agrippa or the Inquisition or both, that really wanted all that stuff attached at the end, I think really it's a really sort of important, I won't say course correction, but it flavors the text in a hugely important way. And it is weird to me that in the critical edition, it's just this the material's just not there.
Yeah, I mean,
Um,
I understand why it's not in the two editions of the DOP
yeah,
that have been translated. It's because it's not in Vittoria Peroni Compagni.
right, right, which
And
is so
why is it
weird.
not in why is it not in her work? I don't know.
Yeah,
Maybe she got tired by the end of it. It's a huge project,
yeah, it's
and
massive.
so
But yeah, it was weird. I remember mentioning this. I was like, yeah, I was talking to Eric Aronson, and I was like, yeah, that's weird that it's not there. And he's like, what do you mean it's not there? I'm like, yeah, the 1533 has a totally different ending. And just again, it's just to show you that even people who really take Agrippa very seriously, it's most of this stuff is basically unknown. Um, and yeah, it's also fun to be able to actually do scholarship that is pushing the field forward. We are like, Agrippa's a major character. These are major, again, like this is a crucially, I think, would say aside from Lazzarelli, is one of the more explicitly Hermetic texts from the Renaissance. And insofar as we're interested in Renaissance Hermeticism, which seems to be a thing that people are interested in, the fact that we're just now rolling this text out is, I think it's pushing the field forward in an important way. Joe Jones, if we could sit down with Agrippa, what would you ask him?
oh, that's a hard question to answer on the spot.
Yeah.
I'd have to think about that one, unfortunately. Do you
I,
know?
I mean, so if he had to answer, it's honestly. Um, if he had to answer, it's honestly. Yeah, I guess I'd want to ask him, like, I'd want to have a further conversation around his own sort of illumination. Like, to what degree, what kind of experiences had he had on the road to that? And I guess maybe the other question is, did he do magic? Because we don't have any evidence that he did. Like we don't have any evidence of, and it's always this cart before the horse question of can you start it before illumination, and this what I call the illumination paradox in Agrippa. But it just seems absolutely inconceivable that he wasn't doing at least some kind of Ficino style book of life, doctor of the soul stuff. So I'd want to have more insight into how he was trying to get to this illuminated state. What does his practices look like? Because I'm fairly confident that there must have been some kind of experiment. Because also I think that when I read behind that, the fact that he didn't, it means that he tried, and it wasn't forthcoming for a variety of reasons. So I'd want to know more about um, Ficino as a practitioner.
Yeah. I I think that's true. I would be interested in asking him specifically about Picatrix.
Mm,
Having worked on Picatrix for so many years, I would be interested to know, you know, did you did you have a copy, or did you just have a friend's copy that you paraphrased or excerpted some bits out of? What is the extent of his relationship with that text? He doesn't have terribly nice things to say about it in some of the letters.
mm-mm,
So I would be interested in having him clarify his position on the text. And so that's probably one question. It's certainly not the ultimate question. I would probably have to ask him about, salvation really
mm,
is he seems to doubt his salvation.
mm,
And like I was saying right uh before we cut out when my internet gave out earlier, I was talking about how Agrippa is firmly planted on the Roman Catholic side, but this is at a time just around the time that the Protestant Reformation is kicking off, and these questions about salvation are coming up. Is it a faith thing? Is it a works and faith thing? Um, like, if you don't think that you're like, do you think you're saved? And if not, like, are you hellbound basically? Like, or are you going to go to purgatory? These kind of, like, what is the ultimate fate of your soul? From your perspective, Agrippa? That's a question I think that I would be interested in asking
yeah.
him.
It's also one of those moments where like you wish you could be the fly on the wall when he and Trithemius were meeting. I mean, can you imagine? I mean, imagine Agrippa walking into the library that Trithemius had access to as a 23-year-old. I mean, can you? I would have loved to have heard that conversation. And again, we pine away for the possibility that John Dee and Giordano Bruno met, and there's no reason to think that they did. But we do have we do have Trithemius and Agrippa meeting in 1510. That would have been incredible. Or to hear the conversation between Johann Weyer and Agrippa, um, because I think, as I said, that in many ways, I think the text that takes up the herald of Agrippa's theology is De Prestigiis. That takes up the sort of skeptical yet religious bent vis-a-vis magic, and so would be interesting to have, to have heard them chat. Let me get some other questions real fast before we wrap up. I think the answer here is definitely no. That not going to happen.
Already been done. I'm tired
Yep.
of translating stuff that's already been done.
Yeah. No. I think. Yeah. I think the answer there is no. I think there's any other ones. I wish we had his Paul commentary. I bet it. I wonder if it survives.
There's a
Um,
Ficino one, De Raptu Pauli. That's a pretty interesting text on the
oh,
rapture
interesting.
of Paul, when he gets swept
Interesting.
up to the
Yeah.
third
The third
heaven.
heaven. Yeah.
It's pretty interesting.
Really? Is it translated?
I think there's like an MA dissertation from the University of Waterloo that, if it doesn't translate the whole thing, it has big passages of it translated.
Interesting. Could you send me that actually when we're done?
Yeah, if yeah, I'll dig it up.
That's fascinating because I'm going to be doing this Merkava class next year, and
Oh yeah.
Paul's going to be he's going to feature into part of that for sure at some point. Um, Okay, well, folks, I'm not seeing a lot of other questions, Agrippa or otherwise. Let me check at the very end. Genghis Galahad always has interesting questions. Um, there's a couple here. We'll maybe do these. Um,
So I suppose I'll read this out loud.
yeah,
Does practice inevitably influence scholarly analysis and inhibit critical thinking, critique, and criticism? I don't think so. I mean, it certainly influences it, but I don't think it inhibits it by any stretch of the imagination. Um, it can certainly bias you, but everybody has biases. There's no one on this earth doesn't have a bias. It's impossible not to be biased. It's just a matter of wearing your cards on your sleeve and making those biases known to people. Is philosophy the most foundational pursuit that covers history and religion? I think so. I think that history and the study of history and religion are branches of philosophy. I think philosophy is the mother of all sciences, ultimately. Everything is downhill from philosophy in my books.
I'd agree. And I'd say to the first question, methodology is methodology. I mean, I don't you that the scholarly methodology is basically that, and if you follow it, you follow it, and whether you're a practitioner or not, I don't think has much to uh, much to do about it. But yeah, I'm all about like as long as you're using a transparent methodology and I kind of know what to expect, then I'm pretty good with it. What student of Agrippa do you feel best continued his metaphysical philosophy? I mean, it's interesting he didn't have any students hardly, but I would say Johann Weyer is the closest thing we get to something like continuity. But yeah, Agrippa had children we know that survived into the 17th century, and none of them seem to have ever. They became merchants basically, so they did not pick up the mantle of Agrippa's thought. But I mean, I don't know about you, Dan, but that's one of the great tragedies for me in all of this is that the magica reformata that Agrippa wanted in some sense, I don't think anyone took up the mantle of that in any substantial way.
Yeah, this question's tricky because I don't think even Agrippa was so sure.
Yeah.
He has phases in his life, right? And I think if you were thinking of like an occult Agrippa, then Francis Barrett is a great example of carrying the torch of that side of Agrippa. Um, but if you're, and that's much later, obviously, we're not talking about a direct lineage. We're talking about somebody who's dusting off books hundreds of years later and promulgating what it was that he was preaching. But if we're talking about the more mystical kind of philosophy, then it's hard to say. I think that there were a lot of people around at the time who were practicing that, and it wasn't really unique to Agrippa.
Mhm.
You know, Ficino, Pico, Reuchlin, Francesco Giorgi, Arcangelo Borgonovo, they are all pretty much on the same page at this kind of mystical, Kabbalistic, Hermetic Catholicism. And that honestly was wiped out by this kind of purity spiraling within the Catholic Church during the Catholic Counter Reformation, where you get Protestants accusing Catholics of deviating from the truth and being too far off with this sola scriptura business. And sola scriptura was never a thing that the Catholic Church was too sold on. That it was always scripture plus the church fathers plus the interpretation of the church. That's where religious truth comes from. It's not simply from scripture; it's from scripture and the church interpreting it. In fact, the church put together the scriptures and into one cohesive whole. And so it's hard to say who directly continued his philosophy. I would say more that he is one proponent of that kind of philosophy among many in that time period, and eventually it gives way to counter Reformation purity spiraling and then later rationalism and the Enlightenment. So those are the two kind of death knells to the occult philosophy.
Yeah, I would agree. Yeah, that all of them faced a common enemy in rationalism and empiricism, and ultimately was a minority movement to begin with. It was never going to have. Also, it was an extremely learned. You had to do a lot of work to get into that world. So it was always going to be a small, self-selecting group of people at the end of the day, and those you can Gnostic your way out of existence by being uh, elite. The eliteness of it also. But again, Agrippa's an interesting character because he's not really he's not an academic. He's a soldier, and he's a unlikely person to have entered into this. I guess another thing I'd go back to, if we could ask Agrippa a question, is I'd want to know more about that secret society he was in, the French Agrippan circle. Who the hell were those people? And we know a little bit about them, but what were they up to? And he seems to have contacts with them in Italy and in France, and his letters make it really clear that they're all really well connected. And so there's just a bunch. That's an outstanding, and it seems like they're the conduit by which a lot of this material is getting into France and getting north of the Alps. That's just a fascinating group of people. That who in the world were those people? It's fascinating stuff. Biases influence Agrippa most. I mean, I would say he was a very devout Roman Catholic.
Yep.
Like if he had a bias, he was hardcore Catholic. He did not have truck with Protestantism. He referred repeatedly to Luther as a heretic. But yeah, he was a Roman Catholic, definitely. All right, folks. Well, thank you guys again for coming and hanging out. All 350 some odd people at some point. So yeah, thank you for coming hanging out. Yeah, we'd really appreciate it if you picked up a copy of the book. And also just read your Agrippa. I absolutely feel like Agrippa is worth studying, just in general. And I really am glad to work with Dan on this project of again getting a little bit more of this very important Renaissance mystic and theologian out there. And appreciate folks, and hope you'll pick up a copy of the book. You can I'll put a pinned comment in the description. And any final thoughts, Dan?
No, just I wanted to thank you for getting me on this project, and for making me a part of the project as a whole, especially as a kind of addendum to the course. I watched every part of the course, of course, and I enjoyed it tremendously. So it was great to be part of that in a kind of hands-on way. I was translating while you were releasing them week by week, and listening to them when they were coming out, and so that was really enjoyable. And so thank you, and really thank you to the audience and everybody who purchased the book. I'm really blown away by how much support this has gotten. Relative to the other things that I've published, this has really been a much greater hit. Let's put it that way. It's a bestseller in a number of categories already. So I've been really impressed by that. And I look forward to people's reviews and to see what people think about the work. And I hope that people enjoy reading it and having it on their shelves. And I look forward to producing more of this sort of thing, given its success. So thanks to everyone.
Absolutely. All right, folks. Well, I'm going to go drop this episode on Schopenhauer, so you can start your weekend off with metaphysical pessimism. And other than that, check out the book in the pinned comment. And I'll be seeing folks around. Thank you.